Despite being far from the front lines, the District of Muskoka made some significant contributions to the war effort during the Second World War. Of course, there were plenty of individual Muskokans who enlisted to serve in the military, but there were also some larger scale operations that took place here, some of them rather interesting and maybe even a little surprising. For example, many people today have heard of Little Norway, the base where exiled Norwegians were given flight training before they returned to Europe to fight in the war. Also, it's fairly well known that there was a prisoner of war camp just north of Gravenhurst, where German soldiers who had been captured were shipped all the way here to sit out the war. Perhaps least remembered, however, is the fact that the Royal Canadian Air Force operated a hospital near Milford Bay, where wounded airmen came to recuperate from their injuries. The story of this hospital really begins with a member of the famous Eaton family, Robert Wellington Eaton. A nephew of department store founder Timothy Eaton, he went to work at the Toronto store in 1891, and eventually rose to become a company director and store superintendent. Not part of the main branch of the family, Robert wasn't as wealthy as some of the other Eatons, but he was still able to afford an impressive cottage here in Muskoka. While the other Eatons established their big estates on Lake Rosso, Robert instead chose to buy property on Lake Muskoka in the fashionable Beaumaris-area. This was located on a point just north of Milford Bay, where Robert had a large 6-bedroom cottage built in 1910. The cottage was called Marmilwood, a name derived from those of Eaton's two daughters, Margaret and Mildred. The cottage was large and spacious, and the Eatons enjoyed playing host there and often inviting guests to stay during the summer. Later, in the mid-1920s, the Eatons bought a classic mahogany launch for use at the cottage, which they also called Marmilwood. This was built by the famed Minette Shields Boat Works in Bracebridge, and this boat was actually lucky enough to survive and can still be seen today. The Eatons themselves were not so fortunate. By 1935, Robert and both of his daughters had passed away, and Marmilwood was no longer being used. Another wealthy family began renting the property, however, and spending their summers there in the late 1930s. Francis Farewell and his wife Edith came from Hamilton. Originally from the Boston area, Farewell was an American who came to Canada in the early 1920s. He founded the Canada Coach Lines, a bus company that served southern Ontario, and after World War II he also became part owner of the Hamilton City Transit System. Edith, who had been widowed several years earlier, had 2 children from her first marriage, Joan and John McCall. They were both young adults at the time, of about 20 years old. The Farewell McCall family had already enjoyed a few summers at Marmilwood before the start of the war. John McCall, who was a student at the Royal Military College in Kingston, quickly enlisted and became a pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Despite his duties, he was able to make it back to the cottage occasionally while on leave, usually bringing some of his fellow airmen with him. Before long, the Farewells began considering how they could host RCAF personnel at the cottage on a more formal basis. Based on an idea that had been tried in England during the First World War, where recuperating soldiers were housed in country estates, the Farewells began putting their plan in motion. The first step was to buy the Marmilwood property, allowing them to use it as they wished. The second step was to establish a charity fund which would be used to pay the expenses of the hospital operation. known as the No. 1 RCAF convalescent hospital, it officially opened in June of 1942. Some additions had to be made to accommodate the patients and staff, the main one being a L-shaped dormitory building with beds for over 40 men, a kitchen, and a dining room. Small cabins and tents were also put up on the ground for staff, and the rooms over the boathouse became the officers' quarters. The hospital's official capacity was for about 100 people, including the staff. Many of the common rooms of the cottage were also used by the hospital for dining, for recreation, and for holding meetings. Surprisingly, the Farewells were still able to use the cottage during this time. Presumably they had the upstairs bedrooms as their exclusive territory, and Edith often stayed at the cottage during the war, playing host. While the hospital had a medical staff, of course, there were no surgeries or other serious procedures being done there. All of that had taken place earlier at other facilities. Instead, the role of the convalescent hospital was to allow soldiers to rest and recuperate, regaining their strength and their confidence. The hospital was based on a new idea of rehabilitation. Instead of repetitive exercises and conventional physical therapy, the outdoor environment provided many more stimulating forms of activity. These were pretty much the same as any Muskoka cottager would enjoy: swimming and diving, boating and water skiing, archery, volleyball, and even performing chores like cutting wood. There were also church services and occasionally dances held on the grounds, with local guests invited. Like on vacation, the atmosphere was quite relaxed. The patients didn't wear their uniforms, and there were no distinctions of rank made between them. While the Muskoka Convalescent Hospital was the first of its kind in Canada, others soon followed, all funded by the Farewells charitable organization. Some friends of the Farewells who had cottages nearby in the Beaumaris region were inspired to offer their own estates in Hamilton for the same purpose. Eventually 8 of these hospitals, comprising 11 distinct properties, were established across the country, from New Brunswick to British Columbia. Unlike the Muskoka Hospital, which was only open from May to October, most of the others operated year-round. This, of course, was a good thing, since it gave the Muskoka patients somewhere else to go at the end of the summer season. After the war, the RCAF returned the property to the Farewells' care, and many of the temporary structures were removed. Some of the cabins, however, were kept, and the large dormitory building was partially dismantled and remodeled. This was later known as the Annex, and it became a more ordinary building where people could stay. Edith and Frances Farewell, along with John and Joan McCall and their own children, continued to enjoy the property for many more years. It's interesting to note that Joan's husband was Bill Braden, who later became quite well known as a hydroplane racer. Also from Hamilton, Braden was the nephew of Harry Greening, and he worked under Frances Farewell at his bus company as an executive. While part of the original Marmilwood estate still remains in the family today, over the years the property was eventually divided up into separate lots, and most of them were sold off. While many of the structures from that time remain, the point of land that was once occupied by the Marmilwood estate now looks like just an ordinary cluster of Muskoka cottages, with little left to indicate what took place there during the war. But of course, what happened then isn't that much different from what happens today. A lot of people enjoying summer in Muskoka.